one of the things that we've learned significantly in the Impact Lab when we've tried to figure out how investors actually understand what good performance looks like, moving away from just the practices of how well they might implement their impact measurement and management practices, they often don't know whether performance is actually good enough, simply because they often can't compare to something. So we only know whether something is good enough when we're able to actually say how well did we do on our impact performance relative to last year, relative to perhaps our peers, or relative to perhaps how big the problem is that we're actually trying to solve for. And it often comes down to what does the data actually look like. So there's a lot of collecting of data, but not necessarily a lot of sense-making of that data. And so that's been quite a tough thing to try and actually figure out. And so what we've done here is just put on the screen, hopefully it comes here, is that these are the types of comments that we hear from people all the time about what they find challenging in impact measurement and management. They're often overwhelmed by the types of frameworks that might be out there, don't know where to start, are understanding how they marry it up to regulatory guidance, for example, which metrics and standards to use, should they use standard ones, should they customize? All of those types of questions are at play in their minds. And what that really highlights is two key problems that I'm going to put on the screen shortly. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask our panelists here to actually comment on how they're in fact actually addressing those problems, because Raleigh Acid, 60 Decibels, and Novata are pioneers in the space of trying to figure out some of these data questions. We're then going to break up as a group into discussions so that you can actually start thinking about what we need to stop, start, and continue in the industry to be able to actually address these problems further. And we're going to look at what the room actually does together. So we'll guide you through that as we go along. So when we're faced with these kinds of challenges, and what we know from the Impact Lab, that comparability and understanding and making sense of the data that many investors are actually collecting from their impact investments, how hard that actually is, what we come down to is two key problems. The one is the issue of interoperability of data. So what that means practically is that one investor may be collecting data in one platform, for example, or one format, but then can't share it with another. That makes data very difficult to try and get to that comparability question. The second problem that folks often have is highlighting how to collect data most efficiently, cost effectively, because impact measurement and management costs a lot, in a way that actually doesn't place the burden often on the investee company, but for the investor to either manage that in an efficient way, so that asking for the same information, for example, asking for the same kind of format, such that it can be made sense of. So those are two big challenges that we're hoping to address in the industry. And what I really want to do is open it up to the discussion now and ask each of our panelists, firstly, how you are addressing those kind of challenges within your own context, but also perhaps together. And secondly, how you are thinking about cost efficiency or just efficiency broadly in respect of that. So maybe I can just start in the middle and ask Carla if you'd like to start us off and kick off a little bit about your thoughts on what you think here.
Yes, of course, and thank you, Dean, and thank you everyone for being here. Well, I'm Carla. I'm currently leading the Latin America work for 60 Decibels, and 60 Decibels is an impact measurement company with a very particular approach that is focusing on stakeholder voice. So before addressing how we are trying to become or support a more cost-efficient approach or how we are addressing these challenges, just to give a bit more context on what we do within the impact measurement spectrum. Let's say if you're a fund and you think of two layers of impact. First layer, the fund to the investee company, so company level data. Companies are able to self-report different metrics, right? Like team composition or the reach of their company activity, so how many people they're actually reaching, ESG metrics in between other aspects that they can self-report as companies. And then companies, on a second layer, have an impact on their target stakeholders. So these target stakeholders are clients, are suppliers, are workers. It depends on what is the primary purpose of impact of that particular company. And where 60 Decibels is focusing is in that specific second layer, the target stakeholder. And the way we are measuring is through stakeholder voice. So essentially, what we are trying to do, and that comes with its own challenges, is how do we gather data to understand impact from the stakeholder's perspective. So here, perception matters. Usually when you do impact evaluation, you try to reduce perception and be as objective as you can. In our approach, we try to fully understand their perspective from that approach. So the way it works, if we want to simplify it, is, let's say, customer intelligence applied to impact measurement. So customer intelligence, they are surveys that are sent to customers, to clients, to understand the attributes of a product or a service so that the company can improve the attributes of that product or service and sell more. If you take that to the social angle, how are those products and services affecting the well-being of those target stakeholders, of those clients, of those suppliers? And to draft a survey that allows us to fully understand this, it cannot be only a quantitative survey, because a quantitative survey just gives you numbers. It really doesn't allow you to dive deeper into the why behind those numbers. So it's a quantitative and qualitative survey where a sample that is statistically significant and representative gets to answer why their financial resilience changed, for example. So that's just a bit of context to now pass on to the challenges. Of course, I would say the main one that Dean mentioned, interoperability. So there are many different ways of measuring impact. It starts by, why do you want to measure impact? Do you want to prove causality and attribution? Or do you want to understand what's going on to improve your impact? So depending on, and you are not so much focused on attribution, but on contribution, let's say. So it really always should start with the why you want to measure. There's not one size fits all. The problem with that is then that you have different measurements as a fund. For certain portfolio companies, others have another type of measurement, and then between funds, how do you really speak to each other because you're measuring in different ways?
Sure.
So that, sorry.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, Carla, if you had to answer the question of how do you know, and perhaps if I can just reflect to you, whether the performance is actually good enough, you've got a deep listening model, which is fantastic, and really it's whether that performance is actually good enough in the eyes of the end stakeholder, the person that actually experiences the impact most, and whether they experience it as a good change in their lived experience. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. And then the challenge becomes, of course, from a fund's perspective, you have portfolio company, where the portfolio company is understanding if their impact is good enough from the perspective of their target stakeholders. Right. The challenge for the fund then is, how do I compare that between companies, right?
Exactly.
So from our perspective, what we do for that challenge is, first, it's good enough to start at least by listening to those end customers.
Right.
So if 50% of them are saying, this is a negative impact,
right,
you at that point don't need to compare. You're like, okay, 50% are saying, fix that negative impact. But then, if 60% are saying this is a positive impact, and we're applying the exact same metric across many different projects globally, and we're building a benchmark, because that's what we do, we build benchmarks, and then the benchmark is 80%, but you are at 60%, then
you know what improvement you need to make.
Then you're comparing yourself to others, and then you dive into the qual data and understand why is only 60% and not 80% saying this,
sure.
And then you try to improve.
Fantastic.
So that's the approach on
Great.
that particular challenge.
I love that. You've outlined that beautifully. Teresa, do you want to try and take the same question again and just talk to us a little bit about how do you know what good performance looks like from an Novartis perspective?
Yeah, it's a great question. Can you?
I think you're on. Yeah.
Great. So a little bit about Nevada. We are a sustainability data management platform that we help investors and companies alike track metrics that matter to you, specific to your unique needs, as well as integrating the sustainability regulations and frameworks, the alphabet soup that exists in impact frameworks worldwide. And I sit on the metrics and regulations team. And so my MO is to really make sense, streamline, translate the alphabet soup of frameworks, and then make metrics that are benchmarkable, accessible. We are 4 years old as a startup company, and even the problems that we had in year one, and much to what you've been talking about, Dean, is in the beginning, people were like, what do I track? How do I identify the impact metrics that I want to track? I think we're much better at identifying, especially with IMM and having intentions and outcomes. Everyone has their own unique inputs, outputs, outcomes, and then the impact intentionality. Of course, right now we have the issue of having almost too much data, but they're all kind of fragmented or they're a little siloed. And so the biggest challenge I see is investors, again, comparing not only to their peers, but to the larger thematic bucket. I personally am very excited about what's going to happen, what's going to succeed the SDGs. Just like what will be the global framework then. So the challenge is investors, clients also want a group of metrics that they can use that's cross-transferable. So simple and easy to understand, but also can speak to the unique impact that they're doing in their investments. So both flexible, but also specific.
Yeah. And a uniform set of metrics that you're looking at, is that right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And so I'm on the metrics and regulations team, so I'm very pro-regulation. I think thus far, like ESG regulations and impact have been somewhat separate, but there is a lot of interoperability. Like GRI, to point out one in particular, the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Standards. It's been adopted at least in 36 jurisdictions, countries around the world, and we see California leading the way with sustainability regulations. I think there is a lot of opportunity there, especially with regards, double materiality has become the mainstream norm. If folks who are in Europe with the CSRD regulation, there's a lot of language, common language that's spurring up, and I think standardization and alignment in the industry is something I'm seeing a lot too.
Fantastic. Ryan, that leaves you.
Yeah, and I really want to speak on, there's been a couple of mentions of uniform metrics and how that can help, but I want to talk about what's on the slide there also, which is deciding which metrics to standardize and which ones to customize, and that also relates to the menu of impact framework. So first, just contextually, I work at Rally Assets. We're an impact investing firm in Canada. We do a lot of private fund-of-funds investing alongside public equity markets. Alongside that, we have a mandate to administer the Government of Canada Social Finance Fund. We're one of 3 wholesalers. And alongside that, we also have a market-building mandate in Canada to improve the impact measurement and management capacity of asset managers and portfolio companies. So we actually get to sit in that space and hear challenges for each of them. And so that leads me to, this concept of, okay, well, how are we we're really focused on bringing more capital into the impact market. So a lot of our asset allocators are asking, how do you know performance is good enough? But we're also getting a ton of data and trying to make sense of that. And so the way that I answer that question is actually we use a very similar approach that is used in financial accounting and how investors are evaluating financial performance. But the key thing here is that in order to do that, you need to balance impact data, and this is the same thing that's happening in financial accounting, impact data that is comparable enough, but is still flexible enough to address the underlying needs and make sure it's accurately capturing what's actually happening, the economic reality. And so there's an interesting component here, which is, we're facing this challenge of how do we develop uniformity with enough flexibility. The accounting industry faced this in the 40s. And the start in the 40s was actually focused on what do capital providers need. They need uniform metrics. It's the only way you can compare. But it failed. And so the question is, why did it fail? And so if anybody has a knowledge of this or just wants to take a wild guess on why did uniformity fail? Why did this one-size-fits-all approach fail? Does anybody want to take a guess? Yeah. I'll give you a hint. It came from a lot of pushback from companies and sectors. So why would they push back? You over there.
It doesn't allow for their innovative solutions to be measured.
Spot on. So, exactly. And also it can be misleading. Like uniformity implies comparability, but actually if the model's different, it actually looks similar, but there's actually some, so there's just a lot of nuance there. And so it evolved today, and what we see in accounting standards is actually a lot of flexibility built in. You can actually have choices, but you need to disclose those choices. So that's how accounting looks today. And so the way in which we are applying that framework at Rally, we're using, and actually just to give an example for those that are trying to understand how is that actually in accounting, I thought it was all the same. Well, if you have a capital asset, you can measure that using historical cost, fair market value, and there's lots of ways you can determine fair market value, lots of assumptions and measurement and certainty involved, right? So there's lots of ambiguity, and we hold impact data, in my view, to a higher standard than we do accounting data, even though accounting is much simpler from my perspective. But the way we're approaching that is we're applying a new standard called the Common Framework, which is by an organization called Common Approach to Impact Measurement. And they use this concept of bounded flexibility, which comes from the financial markets. And it has enabled us to aggregate 900 unique metrics, non-identical metrics, into 48 impact KPIs. And so the way we do that, if we're investing in two different companies, let's just say one's virtual healthcare provider, addressing geographical barriers to healthcare. Another one's addressing language barriers by having interpreters in healthcare settings. Well, they're both improving access to healthcare and working with patients. They're using different metrics, but they're actually doing relatively the same thing. So that's how we're approaching it. That's how the Common Framework works. But going back to the question of, okay, well then we got these impact KPIs, so what? How do we know it's good enough? Well, we're using the Jin's Compass framework, which enables you to actually compare between our funds. We also have the longitudinal, how is it comparing over time. But then Jin also has some impact performance benchmarks with similar KPIs that we can compare ourselves. So we can compare to the market, across our portfolio, and over time. So yeah.
Yeah, and I love how you've used the analogy of financial markets. I often use it as an analog to actually compare, and particularly the point that sometimes impact measurement and management is often held to a different standard to that which we hold financial measurement and management as well. And it is okay sometimes to actually make assumptions about what you're actually doing. But to be declarative about what those assumptions actually are, so that the transparency is there and it's not obscure or opaque to people that are actually trying to consider whether this investment from an impact perspective is better than that one, or this fund manager is more effective from an impact perspective than that one. And that's probably a clue as to some of the things that may need to change within the industry to actually shift some of the impact measurement and management practices with regard to data. So I'm mindful of the fact that there is a lot of knowledge in this room, and what we want to be able to do is to harness that right now. And so what we're going to ask you to do is to break up into groups. We're going to move amongst you to help facilitate a little bit. And what we really want you to do is to answer these questions. So what we'd like you to think about, I'm going to stand up because I can hardly see the screen and make sense. So what we want you to do is to think a little bit about what your organization, the industry might need to do, whether you do that from your own perspective, such as your organization, or if you're part of an industry body of some sort. What do you think needs to stop, start, and continue in the industry to get better at making sense of the data that we may collect, or what data providers like Novata, 60 Decibels, and Riley Assets need to do, and others that are in the field, to be able to actually shift the needle, as it were. I'm going to ask for a group here in the front, one at the back, one over there, and one here. Self-select where you actually want to be, move your chairs around to be able to do that. But what I'm going to ask you to do in those groups is to actually, if you, either with your scan the QR code, or you can go to menti.com and put in the code. There's a data gathering mechanism there for you to be able to, in your groups, jot down some thoughts of what you're actually eliciting in your discussions, so that we can actually look at that together and see what the room is actually suggesting needs to stop, start, and continue. once we've done that for about 10, 15 minutes or so, we'll come back and we'll react to some of the things that you're actually sharing with us.